Welcome to the Audio Renaissance Tapes presentation of What is Zen? Written by Daisetsu T. Suzuki. Adapted for audio and produced by Tony Hutz. And read by Christopher Reed.
Before beginning, I wish to make a brief personal comment on the author and the text. D.T. Suzuki, Japan's foremost authority on Zen Buddhism, and the man who introduced Zen Buddhism to Western readers, died in Tokyo in 1966 at the age of 95. Zen and Japanese Culture, the work from which this program is drawn, consists primarily of a series of lectures Suzuki delivered during the 1930s in England and the United States, and should be viewed in its historical context. It is worth remembering that by the late 1940s, Suzuki expressed a wish to revise some of his earlier works on Japanese cultural identity, most especially those concerning the influence of Zen Buddhism on the Japanese martial traditions. Zen and Japanese Culture, however, remains as it was originally written. It remains a brilliant and seminal work on Zen Buddhism, from a scholar of immense breadth and depth. Before I proceed to discuss the influence of Zen on Japanese culture, I must explain something of what Zen is. Briefly, Zen is one of the products of the Chinese mind after its contact with Indian thought, which came to China in the 1st century AD through the medium of Buddhist teachings. There were some aspects of Buddhism in the form in which it came to China that the people of the Middle Kingdom did not appreciate. For instance, its advocacy of a homeless life, its transcendentalism or world-fleeing and life-denying tendency, and so on. At the same time, its profound philosophy, its subtle dialectics and penetrating analyses and speculations stirred Chinese thinkers, especially the Taoists. Compared with Indians, the Chinese people are not so very philosophically minded. They are rather practical and devoted to worldly affairs. They are attached to the earth. They are not stargazers. While the Chinese mind was profoundly stimulated by the Indian way of thinking, it never lost its touch with the plurality of things. It never neglected the practical side of our daily life. This national or racial psychological idiosyncrasy brought about the transformation of Indian Buddhism into Zen Buddhism. One of the first things Zen accomplished in China as soon as it had gathered its forces and was strong enough to stand by itself was to establish a special form of monasticism quite distinct from the older kind of monkish living. The Zen monastery became a self-governing body divided into so many departments, each of which had its own office to serve the community. A noteworthy feature of this institution was the principle of complete democracy. While the elders were naturally respected, all members were equally to engage in manual labor such as gathering fuel, cultivating the land, and picking tea leaves. In this even the master himself joined, and while working with his brotherhood, he guided them to the proper understanding of Zen. This way of living significantly distinguished the Zen monastery from the Sangha brotherhood of the earlier Buddhists of India. The Zen monks were not only democratic, they were willing to employ themselves in all the practical ways of life. They were thus economically minded as well as politically minded. In metaphysics, Zen absorbed much of Taoist teachings modified by Buddhist speculations. But in its practical conduct of life, it completely ignored both the Taoist transcendentalism and the Indian aloofness from productive life. When a Zen master was asked what his future life would be, he unhesitatingly answered, "Let me be a donkey or a horse and work for the villagers." Another departure from the older pattern of monkish brotherhood, whether Christian or Buddhist or anything else, was that the Zen monks were not always engaged in offering prayers, practicing penance, or performing other so-called deeds of piety, nor in reading or reciting the canonical books, discussing their contents, or studying them under the master individually or collectively. What the Zen monks did, besides attending to various practical affairs, both manual and menial, was to listen to the master's occasional sermons, which were short and cryptic, and to ask questions and get answers. The answers, however, were bizarre and full of incomprehensibles, and they were quite frequently accompanied by direct actions. I will cite one of such examples, perhaps an extreme one, Though it did not take place between master and monk, but between monks themselves, it will illustrate the spirit of Zen which prevailed in its earlier days toward the end of the Tang dynasty in the 9th century. A monk coming out of the monastery that was under the leadership of Rinzai met a party of 3 traveling monks belonging to another Buddhist school, and one of the 3 ventured to question the Zen monk. How deep is the river of Zen? The reference to the river arose from their encounter taking place on a bridge. The Zen monk, fresh from his own interview with Rinzai, who was noted for his direct action, lost no time in replying. Find out for yourself, he said, and offered to throw the questioner from the bridge. But fortunately his 2 friends interceded and pleaded for mercy, which saved the situation. Zen is not necessarily against words, but it is well aware of the fact that they are always liable to detach themselves from realities and turn into conceptions. And this conceptualization is what Zen is against. The Zen monk just cited may be an extreme case, but the spirit is there. Zen insists on handling the thing itself, and not an empty abstraction. It is for this reason that Zen neglects reading or reciting the sutras, the collection of sermons given by the Buddha, or engaging in discourses on abstract subjects. And this is a cause of Zen's appeal to men of action in the broadest sense of the term. Through their practical mindedness, the Chinese people, and also to a certain extent the Japanese, have taken greatly to Zen. Zen is discipline in enlightenment. Enlightenment means emancipation, and emancipation is no less than freedom. We talk very much these days about all kinds of freedom, political, economic, and otherwise, but these freedoms are not at all real. As long as they are on the plane of relativity, the freedoms or liberties we glibly talk about are far from being such. The real freedom is the outcome of enlightenment. When someone realizes this, in whatever situation they may find themselves, they are always free in their inner life. Zen is the religion of Jiyu, or self-reliance, and Jizai, self-being. Enlightenment occupies the central point of teaching in all schools of Buddhism, Hinayana and Mahayana, self-power and other power, the holy path and the pure land, because the Buddha's teachings all start from his enlightenment experience about 2,500 years ago in the northern part of India. Every Buddhist is, therefore, expected to receive enlightenment either in this world or in one of his future lives. Without enlightenment, either already realized or to be realized somehow and sometime and somewhere, there will be no Buddhism. Zen is no exception. In fact, it is Zen that makes most of enlightenment, or satori, called Wu in Chinese. To realize satori, Zen opens for us 2 ways in general, verbal and actional. First, Zen verbalism is quite characteristic of Zen, though it is so completely differentiated from the philosophy of linguistics or dialectics that it may not be correct to apply the term verbalism to Zen at all. But as we all know, we human beings cannot live without language, for we are so made that we can sustain our existence only in group life. Love is the essence of humanity. Love needs something to bestow itself upon. Human beings must live together in order to lead a life of mutual love. Love to be articulate requires a means of communication, which is language. Inasmuch as Zen is one of the most significant human experiences, one must resort to language to express it to others as well as to oneself. But Zen verbalism has its own features, which violate all the rules of the science of linguistics. In Zen, experience and expression are one. Zen verbalism expresses the most concrete experience. To give examples, a Zen master produces his staff before his congregation and declares, "You do not call it a staff. What would you call it?" Someone comes out of the audience, takes the master's staff away from him, breaks it into 2 and throws it down. All this is the outcome of the master's illogical announcement. Another master, holding up his staff, says, "If you have one, I give you mine. If you have none, I will take it away from you." There is no rationalism in this. Still another master once gave this sermon, "When you know what this staff is, you know all. You have finished the study of Zen." Without further remark, he left the hall. This is what I call Zen verbalism. The philosophy of Zen comes out of it. The philosophy, however, is not concerned to elucidate all these verbal riddles, but to reach the mind itself, which, as it were, exudes or secretes them as naturally, as inevitably, as the clouds rise from the mountain peaks. What concerns us here is not the substance thus exuded or secreted, that is, words or language, but as something hovering around there, though we cannot exactly locate it and say here. To call it the mind is far from the fact of experience. It is an unnameable X. It is no abstraction. It is concrete enough and direct, as the eye sees the sun is, but it is not to be subsumed in the categories of linguistics. As soon as we try to do this, it disappears. The Buddhists, therefore, call it the unattainable, the ungraspable. It is for this reason that a staff is a staff and at the same time not a staff, or that a staff is a staff just because it is not a staff. The word is not to be detached from the thing, or the fact, or the experience. The Zen masters have the saying, "Examine the living words and not the dead ones." The dead ones are those that no longer pass directly and concretely and intimately on to the experience. They are conceptualized. They are cut off from the living roots. They have ceased then to stir up my being from within, from itself. They are no more what the masters would call the one word, which when understood leads immediately to the understanding of hundreds of thousands of other words or statements given by the Zen masters. Zen verbalism deals with these living words. The second disciplinary approach to the experience of enlightenment is actional. In a sense, verbalism is also actional as long as it is concrete and personal. But in the actional, what we call the body, according to our sense testimony, is involved. When Rinzai was asked what the essence of Buddhist teaching was, he came right down from his seat and, taking hold of the questioner by the front of his robe, slapped his face and then let him go. The questioner stood there stupefied. The bystanders remarked, "Why don't you bow?" This woke him from his reverie, and when he was about to make a bow to the master, he had his satori. When Baso, a teacher of the 8th century, took a walk with Hayakujo, one of his attendant monks, he noticed the wild geese flying. He asked, "Where are they flying?" Hayakujo answered, "They are already flown away." Baso turned around and, taking hold of Hayakujo's nose, gave it a twist. Hayakujo cried out, "Oh, master, it hurts!" "Who says they are flown away?" was the master's retort. This made Hayakujo realize that the master was not talking at all about the conceptualized geese disappearing far away in the clouds. The master's purpose was to call Hayakujo's attention to the living goose that moves along with Hayakujo himself, not outside but within his person. This person is Rinzai's true man in all nakedness, going in and out through your senses. I wonder if this is that third man, often referred to by some modern writers as walking beside you, or on the other side of you, or behind you. For example, in T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, he gives this description of the anguish of the apostles after Calvary. "Who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together. But when I look ahead up the white road, there is always another one walking beside you, gliding wrapped in a brown mantle, hooded. I do not know whether a man or a woman. But who is that on the other side of you?" We may say this is a practical lesson, teaching by action, learning by doing. There is something like it in the actional approach to enlightenment. But a direct action in Zen has another meaning. There is a deeper purpose which consists in awakening in the disciple's mind a certain consciousness that is attuned to the pulsation of reality. The following story is in a somewhat different vein. It simply illustrates how important it is to grasp a trick by going through a practical situation oneself without any outside aid. It exemplifies the pedagogic methodology of Zen's spirit of self-reliance. This is in perfect accord with the teaching of the Buddha. Do not rely on others, nor on the reading of the sutras and shastras. Be your own lamp. Goso Hoyen, an 11th century teacher of the Sung dynasty, tells us the following to illustrate the Zen spirit that goes beyond intellect, logic, and verbalism. If people ask me what Zen is like, I will say that it is like learning the art of burglary. The son of a burglar saw his father growing older and thought, If he is unable to carry on his profession, who will be the breadwinner of the family except myself? I must learn the trade. He intimated the idea to his father, who approved of it. One night the father took the son to a big house, broke through the fence, entered the house, and opening one of the large chests, told the son to go in and pick out the clothing. As soon as the son got into it, the father dropped the lid and securely applied the lock. The father now came out to the courtyard and loudly knocked at the door, waking up the whole family. Then he quietly slipped away by the hole in the fence. The residents got excited and lighted candles, but they found that the burglar had already gone. The son, who had remained all the time securely confined in the chest, thought of his cruel father. He was greatly mortified. Then a fine idea flashed upon him. He made a noise like the gnawing of a rat. The family told the maid to take a candle and examine the chest. When the lid was unlocked, out came the prisoner, who blew out the light, pushed away the maid, and fled. The people ran after him. Noticing a well by the road, he picked up a large stone and threw it into the water. The pursuers all gathered round the well, trying to find the burglar drowning himself in the dark hole. In the meantime, he went safely back to his father's house. He blamed his father deeply for his narrow escape. Said the father, "Be not offended, son. Just tell me how you got out of it." When the son told him all about his adventures, the father remarked, "There you are. You have learned the art." The idea of the story is to demonstrate the futility of verbal instruction and conceptual presentation as far as the experience of enlightenment is concerned. Satori must be the outgrowth of one's inner life, and not a verbal implantation brought from the outside. There is a famous saying given by one of the earlier masters of the Tang dynasty which declares that the Tao is no more than one's everyday life experience. When the master was asked what he meant by this, he replied, "When you are hungry, you eat. When you are thirsty, you drink. When you meet a friend, you greet him." This, some may think, is no more than animal instinct or social usage, and there is nothing that may be called moral, much less spiritual, in it. If we call it the Tao, some may think, what a cheap thing the Tao is after all. Those who have not penetrated into the depths of our consciousness, including both the conscious and the unconscious, are liable to hold such a mistaken notion as the one just cited. But we must remember that if the Tao is something highly abstract, transcending our daily experiences, it will have nothing to do with the actualities of life. Life as we live it is not concerned with generalization. If it were, the intellect would be everything, and the philosopher would be the wisest man. But as Kierkegaard points out, the philosopher builds a fine palace, but he is doomed never to live in it. He has a shed for himself, next door to what he constructed for others, including himself, to look at. Mencius says, "The Tao is near and people seek it far away." This means that the Tao is our everyday life itself. And indeed, it is due to this fact that the Tao is so hard to grasp, so elusive to point out. How elusive, how ungraspable. The Tao that can be at all predicated is not the Tao of always so-ness, or Chang Tao. The Tao is really very much more than mere animal instinct and social usage, though those elements are also included in it. It is something deeply embedded in every one of us. Indeed in all beings, sentient and non-sentient, and it requires something altogether different from the so-called scientific analysis. It defies our intellectual pursuit because of being too concrete, too familiar, hence beyond definability. It is there confronting us, no doubt, but not obtrusively and threateningly, like Mount Everest to the mountain climbers. What is Zen? This is tantamount to asking, what is Tao? "I do not understand," was one master's answer. "What is Zen?" "The silk fan gives me enough of a cooling breeze," was another answer. "What is Zen?" "Zen," was still another's response. Perhaps Lao Tzu's description may be more approachable for most of us than those of the Zen masters. As he wrote in the Tao Te Ching, "The Tao is something vague and undefinable. How undefinable, how vague. Yet in it there is a form. How vague, how undefinable. Yet in it there is a thing. How obscure, how deep! Yet in it there is a substance. The substance is genuine, and in its sincerity. From of old until now its name never departs, whereby it inspects all things. How do I know all things in their suchness? It is because of this. I should mention that in my translations of Japanese poetry, no attempt is made to reproduce the original rhythm. They are mostly literal renderings, with the fewest additions necessary to make the sense somewhat more intelligible to English listeners. Now consider for a moment the thought, its name never departs. When the name does not depart, as we usually make it do from the substance to which it is undetachably fixed, the name is the substance, and the substance the name. There is a perfect identity, and thereby as soon as the name is pronounced, the substance, that is, the all, is inspected, not in its abstraction, but in its sincerity and concreteness. The object of Zen training consists in making us realize that Zen is our daily experience, and that it is not something put in from the outside. Tenno Dogo, who lived from 748 to 807, illustrates the point most eloquently in his treatment of a novice monk, while an unknown Japanese swordmaster demonstrates it in the more threatening manner characteristic of his profession. Tenno Dogo's story runs as follows. Dogo had a disciple called Soshin. When Soshin was taken in as a novice, it was perhaps natural of him to expect lessons in Zen from his teacher the way a schoolboy is taught at school. But Dogo gave him no special lessons on the subject, and this bewildered and disappointed Soshin. One day he said to the master, "It is some time since I came here, but not a word has been given to me regarding the essence of the Zen teaching." Dogo replied, "Since your arrival I have ever been giving you lessons on the matter of Zen discipline." What kind of lesson could it have been? When you bring me a cup of tea in the morning, I take it. When you serve me a meal, I accept it. When you bow to me, I return the bow. How else do you expect to be taught in the mental discipline of Zen? Soshin hung his head for a while, pondering the puzzling words of the master. The master said, "If you want to see right at once. When you begin to think, you miss the point." The swordsman's story is this. When a disciple came to a master to be disciplined in the art of sword play, the master, who was in retirement in his mountain hut, agreed to undertake the task. The pupil was made to help him gather kindling, draw water from the nearby spring, split wood, make fires, cook rice, sweep the rooms and the garden, and generally to look after his household. There was no regular or technical teaching in the art. After some time the young man became dissatisfied, for he had not come to work as a servant to the old gentleman, but to learn the art of swordsmanship. So one day he approached the master and asked him to teach him. The master agreed. The result was that the young man could not do any piece of work with any feeling of safety. For when he began to cook rice early in the morning, the master would appear and strike him from behind with a stick. When he was in the midst of his sweeping, he would be feeling the same sort of blow from somewhere, some unknown direction. He had no peace of mind. He had to be always on the lookout. Some years passed before he could successfully dodge the blows from wherever they might come. But the master was not quite satisfied with him yet. One day the master was found cooking his own vegetables over an open fire. The pupil took it into his head to avail himself of this opportunity. Taking up his big stick, he let it fall over the head of the master, who was then stooping over the cooking pan to stir its contents. But the pupil's stick was caught by the master with the cover of the pan. This opened the pupil's mind to the secrets of the art, which had hitherto been kept from him, and to which he had so far been a stranger. He then, for the first time, appreciated the unparalleled kindness of the master. The secrets of perfect swordsmanship consist in creating a certain frame or structure of mentality which is always made ready to respond instantly, that is, immediately, to what comes from the outside. While technical training is of great importance, it is, after all, something artificially, consciously, calculatingly added and acquired. Unless the mind that avails itself of the technical skill somehow attunes itself to a state of the utmost fluidity or mobility, anything acquired or superimposed lacks spontaneity of natural growth. This state prevails when the mind is awakened to a satori. What the swordsman aimed at was to help the disciple attain to this realization. It cannot be taught by any system specifically designed for the purpose. It must simply grow from within. The master's system was really no system in the proper sense, but there was a natural method in his apparent craziness, and he succeeded in awakening in his young disciple's mind something that touched off the mechanism needed for the mastery of swordsmanship. Dogo the Zen master did not have to be attacking his disciple all the time with a stick. The swordsman's object was more definite and limited to the area of the sword, whereas Dogo wanted to teach by getting to the source of being from which everything making up our daily experience ensues. Therefore, when Soshin began to reflect on the remark Dogo made to him, Dogo told him, "No reflecting whatever. When you want to see, see immediately. As soon as you tarry, that is, as soon as an intellectual interpretation or mediation takes place, the whole thing goes awry." This means that in the study of Zen, conceptualization must go, for as long as we tarry at this level, we can never reach the area where Zen has its life. The door of enlightenment experience opens by itself, as one finally faces the deadlock of intellectualization. The slipperiness or elusiveness of the truth, or reality, or shall I say God, when one tries to get hold of it or him by means of concepts or intellection, is like trying to catch a catfish with a gourd. We can now state a few things about Zen in a more or less summary way. 1. Zen discipline consists in attaining enlightenment, or as the Japanese call it, satori. 2. Satori finds a meaning hitherto hidden in our daily concrete particular experiences, such as eating, drinking, or business of all kinds. 3. The meaning thus revealed is not something added from the outside. It is in being itself, in becoming itself, in living itself. This is called in Japanese a life of kono mama, or sono mama. Kono is this, sono that, and mama means as it isness. Kono or sono mama means the isness of a thing, reality in its isness. Thus kono mama or sono mama also corresponds to the Sanskrit tathata or suchness, and to the Chinese chimo. 4. Some may say there cannot be any meaning in mere isness, but this is not the view held by Zen, for according to it, isness is the meaning. When I see into it, I see it as clearly as I see myself reflected in a mirror. 5. This is what made Hokoji, a lay disciple of the 8th century, declare, "How wondrous this! How mysterious! I carry fuel. I draw water." The fuel carrying or the water drawing itself, apart from its utilitarianism, is full of meaning, hence its wonder, its mystery. 6. Zen does not therefore indulge in abstraction or in conceptualization. In its verbalism, it may sometimes appear that Zen does this a great deal, but this is an error most commonly entertained by those who do not at all know Zen. 7. Satori is emancipation, moral, spiritual, as well as intellectual. When I am in my isness, thoroughly purged of all intellectual sediments, I have my freedom in its primary sense. 8. When the mind now abiding in its isness, which, to use Zen verbalism, is not isness, and thus free from intellectual complexities and moralistic attachments of every description, surveys the world of the senses in all its multiplicities, it discovers in it all sorts of values hitherto hidden from sight. Here opens to the artist a world full of wonders and miracles. 9. The artist's world is one of free creation, and this can come only from intuitions directly and immediately rising from the isness of things, unhampered by senses and intellect. He creates forms and sounds out of formlessness and soundlessness. To this extent, the artist's world coincides with that of Zen. 10. What differentiates Zen from the arts is this. While artists have to resort to the canvas and brush or mechanical instruments or some other mediums to express themselves, Zen has no need of things external except the body, in which the practitioner of Zen is, so to speak, embodied. From the absolute point of view, this is not quite correct. I say it only in concession to the worldly way of saying things. What Zen does is to delineate itself on the infinite canvas of time and space the way the flying geese cast their shadow on the water below without any idea of doing so, while the water reflects the geese just as naturally and as unintentionally. 11. The practitioner of Zen is an artist to the extent that, as the sculptor chisels out a great figure deeply buried in a mass of inert matter, the practitioner of Zen transforms his own life into a work of creation, which exists, as Christians might say, in the mind of God. With this preliminary, I wish to treat next the part Zen Buddhism has played in the molding of Japanese culture and character, especially as exhibited in the arts generally, and in the study and propagation of Confucianism and general education.